Hi, sixth graders. This is Mrs. Kalen here with another library lesson for you this week. We're continuing on our discussion of primary sources, and we're going to conclude today with a read aloud and an exploration of some really powerful, important primary sources that I really think tell a story in a way that is incredibly unique and incredibly powerful, even more so than you might find with a secondary source. So just as a reminder, what's a primary source? So as we learned in the last couple of weeks, a primary source is something that comes straight out of history. These can include letters, documents, photographs, something that really documents an important, or even sometimes a not so important moment from history. Something that could, as we're going to see today, something that could have seemed insignificant at the time that it was created, that now looking back with the lens of history feels really important and shows us something from that time that is unique and powerful. So what we are going to do today is take a look at the diary of Anne Frank. And this is something that I know with Mrs. Chang's class on our last day that we were in the library together and we were talking about nonfiction books. This was a book that came up that we had a bit of a discussion about, and there was a lot of interest in this book. Ms. Nguyen's class, we didn't get to have that class together, but that is okay. We can start our discussion now. So what we're going to do is take a look at Anne Frank, who she was, the time that she lived in. I'm going to show you a little bit of the website of the Anne Frank House Museum that has many primary sources that tell you about her and her life and where she lived and why her story was incredible. I'm going to read you a few excerpts from her diary, and then I'm going to leave you with a couple of links to explore on your own so that you can see some of these primary sources at your own pace. So first of all, I'm going to do a screen share here so that you can see some of these really incredible resources from the Anne Frank House, and we can learn a little bit about who she is or who she was. Okay, so here we go. So, okay, here we are. So who was Anne Frank? Anne Frank was a girl who lived in Amsterdam, and her story was told in the she told her story in the 1940s, and this was at a time when the Netherlands, where Amsterdam is the capital, was occupied by the German Nazi government. This was a time that it was very dangerous to be different in many ways. And I know that you've been studying this time period in your literature class with Ms. Nguyen, and so this was a time that it was very dangerous to be Jewish in particular. Anne Frank was a Jewish girl who, in 1942, when she wrote a diary of her life, she was about the same age as you. She turned 13 years old during the time that she kept this diary. And she and her family, who were middle class, who had been living a pretty comfortable life in Amsterdam, were forced into hiding in a tiny apartment at the back of her father's workplace building. And it was a hidden annex where they believed that no one would be able to find their family hidden. I'm pausing. Sorry about that. Is that okay?
In my notebook, which is
There, is it one of these?
No, this one.
Okay. So during this time that she was hidden, she and her family lived in this tiny space confined with another complete family, a young boy about her age or between her age and her older sister's age, one other person, and were helped by her father's employees who lived and worked downstairs. They were hidden in this apartment for 2 full years before they were discovered. And once they were discovered, they were tragically captured and were all sent to a concentration camp where she later died. Her father, however, was able to survive and came back to the place where they had lived in this apartment and found Anne's diary. The diary was later published and became a document that really showed what happened at this time. I'm going to actually go back to me here. This was a document that really showed what happened this time from the voice of a real person. When you read Anne Frank's diary, you see not only the fear and the challenges of this time, how they feared for their lives, their difficult living situation, but you see a really normal girl who is going through many of the same experiences that teenagers and kids who are growing up go through every day. She argued with her sister. She had conflict with her parents. She wanted to have friends and boyfriends and to be able to get to know the world that she was growing up into. And all of this happened in this really unusual and terrible circumstance. So that's some context for who she was. And I'm going to read a couple of short excerpts from her diary. And then I'm going to show you through the Anne Frank House Museum, which was what I was showing you before there. You can actually go on a virtual tour. The Anne Frank House Museum is actually the house where she and her family were in hiding. You can go and you can see their annex, as they call it, the apartment where they were hiding. You can touch the walls that she was hiding in. You can see how small the space actually was. You can read about her in the space where she actually lived. And I will take you on a very short virtual tour and give you some time to explore that and some other primary source resources on your own afterward. So I'm going to just be reading from a printout here. A student has the books at home. The book that I have here is actually, this is a play that her diary was adapted into. So I'm not going to read the play, but I'm going to read some excerpts from the actual diary. So this first entry, this is actually the first entry in the diary. This begins Saturday, June 20th, 1942. Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me. Not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on, neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. I feel like writing, and I have an even greater need to get all kinds of things off my chest. Paper has more patience than people. That's a quote. I thought of this saying one of those days when I was feeling a little depressed and was sitting at home with my chin in my hands, bored and listless, wondering whether to stay in or go out. I finally stayed where I was, brooding. Yes, paper does have more patience, since I'm not planning to let anyone else read this stiff-backed notebook, grandly referred to as a diary, unless I shall ever find a real friend. It probably won't make a bit of difference. Now I'm back to the point that prompted me to keep a diary in the first place. I don't have a friend. Let me put it more clearly, since no one will believe me, the 13-year-old girl is completely alone in the world. And I am not. I have loving parents and a 16-year-old sister, and there are about 30 people I can call friends. I have a throng of admirers, and I can't keep their adoring eyes off of me. And sometimes I have to resort to a broken pocket mirror and try to catch a glimpse of me in the classroom. I have family, loving aunts, and a good home. No, on the surface, I seem to have everything except for one true friend. All I can think about when I'm with friends is having a good time. I can't bring myself to talk about anything but ordinary everyday things. We don't seem to be able to get any closer, and that's the problem. Maybe it's all my fault that we don't confide in each other. In any case, that's just how things are. And unfortunately, they're not liable to change, and this is why I've started a diary. To enhance the image of this long-awaited friend in my imagination, I don't want to jot down the facts in this diary the way most people do, but I want the diary to be my friend. And I'm going to call this friend Kitty. Since no one would understand a word of my stories to Kitty if I were to plunge right in, I'd better provide a brief sketch of my life, as much as I dislike doing so. My father, the most adorable father I've ever seen, didn't marry my mother until he was 36 and she was 25. My sister Margot was born in Frankfurt in Germany in 1926. I was born on June 12, 1929. I lived in Frankfurt until I was 4. Because we're Jewish, my father immigrated to Holland in 1933, where he became managing director of the Dutch Opetka company, which manufactures products used in making jam. My mother, Edith Hollander Frank, went with him to Holland in September, while Margot and I were sent to Anken to stay with our grandmother. Margot went to Holland in December, and I followed in February, and I was plunked down on the table as a birthday present for Margot. I started right away at the Montessori nursery school. I stayed there till I was 6, which the time I started first grade. In 6th grade, my teacher was Mrs. Cooperus, the principal. At the end of the year, we were both in tears as we said a heartfelt farewell because I had been accepted to the Jewish Lyceum, where Margot also went to school. Now, I'm going to stop there for just a moment and just ask you, with the exception of the dates that she used, talking about when she was born, could that have been written at any time in any country? Could that have been written by you in 2020 or me as a 13-year-old in 1995 or my mother as a 13-year-old in 1963? Those experiences that she writes about so far feel very timeless, right? This is the part where things start to change. Our lives were not without anxiety, since our relatives in Germany were suffering under Hitler's anti-Jewish laws. After the pogroms in 1938, my 2 uncles, now pogroms is a word that I'm not sure that you will be familiar with. Pogroms were the word that was used for anti-Jewish attacks that were usually included a lot of vandalism, property being destroyed, people being beaten and attacked. It was usually kind of a mob of people that would kind of wreak destruction and havoc on a community. My 2 uncles, my mother's brothers, fled Germany, finding safe refuge in North America. My elderly grandmother came to live with us. She was 73 years old at the time. After May 1940, the good times were few and far between. First there was the war, then the capitulation and the arrival of the Germans, which is when the trouble started for the Jews. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. Jews were required to wear a yellow star. Jews were required to turn in their bicycles. Jews were forbidden to ride streetcars. Jews were forbidden to ride in cars, even their own. Jews were required to do their shopping between 3 and 5 p.m. Jews were required to frequent only Jewish-owned barber shops and beauty parlors. Jews were forbidden to be out on the streets between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Jews were forbidden to attend theaters, movies, or any form of entertainment. They were forbidden to use swimming pools, tennis courts, hockey fields, or any other athletic fields. Jews were forbidden to go rowing. Jews were forbidden to take part in any athletic activity in public. Jews were forbidden to sit in their gardens and those of their friends after 8 p.m. Jews were forbidden to visit Christians in their homes. Jews were required to attend Jewish-only schools, etc. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that, but life went on. Jacques always said to me, I don't dare do anything because I'm afraid it's not allowed anymore. The four of us were still doing well, and that brings me to the present date of June 20th, 1942, the solemn dedication of my diary. So that is where Anne Frank's story begins. So we can tell there are some circumstances that are bringing some pretty disruption, there's a lot of disruption being brought into her life, right? I'm going to read a couple other short excerpts that will kind of give a little bit of a different side to this experience. Thursday, July 9th, 1942. Dearest Kitty, so there we were, father, mother, and I, walking in the pouring rain, each of us with a school bag and shopping bag filled to the brim with our most varied assortment of items. People on their way to work at that early hour gave us sympathetic looks. You could tell by their faces that they were sorry they couldn't offer us some kind of transportation. The conspicuous yellow star spoke for itself. Only when we were walking down the street did father and mother reveal, little by little, what our plan was. For months, we've been moving as much of our furniture and apparel out of our apartment as we could. It was agreed that we'd go into hiding on July 16th. Because of Margot's call-up notice, the plan had been moved up 10 days, which meant that we'd have to make do with less orderly rooms. So the reason that they had gone into hiding, or what motivated them to go when they did, was that her sister Margot, who was 16 years old at the time, she had received a call-up notice to be sent to a labor camp where she would be forced to work basically in slave labor for the Nazis. The hiding place was located in Father's office building. That's a little hard for outsiders to understand, so I'll explain. Father didn't have a lot of people working in his offices, just Mr. Kugler, Mr. Kleiman, Miep, and 23-year-old typist named Bep Boskajul. My Dutch is not very good. All of whom were informed of our coming. Mr. Voskajul, Bep's father, works in the warehouse along with 2 assistants, none of whom were told anything. Here is the description of the building. The large warehouse on the ground floor is used as a workroom and storeroom and divided into several different sections, such as the stockroom and the milling room where cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were ground. Next to the warehouse door is another outside door, a separate entrance to the office. And just inside that door is a second door, and beyond that, a stairway. At the top of the stairs is another door with a frosted window with the words office written in black letters. This is the big front office, very large, very full of light. All 3 of them work there during the day. After passing through an alcove containing a safe, a wardrobe, and a big supply cupboard, you come to a small, dark, stuffy back office. This used to be shared by Mr. Kugler and Mr. Van Daan, but now Mr. Kugler is its only occupant. Mr. Kugler's office can be reached from the hallway, but only through a glass door that can be opened from the inside, but not easily from the outside. If you leave Mr. Kugler's office and proceed through the long, narrow hallway, past the coal bin and go up 4 steps, you can find yourself in the private office, the showpiece of the entire building. Elegant mahogany furniture, a linoleum floor covered with throw rugs, a radio, a fancy lamp, everything first class. Next door is a spacious kitchen with a hot water heater and 2 gas burners, and beside that a bathroom. That's the second floor. A wooden staircase leads from the hallway downstairs to the 3rd floor. At the top of the stairs is a landing with doors on either side. Now this is sort of the introduction to the space where they really are going to be living. A door to the left takes you to a spice storage area, attic and loft in the front part of this house. A typically Dutch, very steep, ankle-twisting flight of stairs also runs past the front of the house to another door opening to the street. The door to the right of the landing leads to the secret annex at the back of the house. No one would ever suspect there were so many rooms behind that plain gray door. There is just one small step in front of the door, and then you're inside. Straight ahead of you, there is a steep flight of stairs. To the left is a narrow hallway opening to a room that serves now as the Frank family's living, for the Frank family's living. Next door is a smaller room, and the study of two young ladies of the family. To the right of the stairs is a windowless washroom with a sink. The door in the corner leads to the toilet, and another one to the top to Margot and my room. If you go up the stairs and open the door at the top, you'd be surprised to see such a large, light, and spacious room in an old canal-side house like this. It contains a stove, thanks to the fact that it used to be Mr. Kugler's laboratory, and a sink. This will be the kitchen and bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Van Dam, as well as the general living room, dining room, and study for all of us. A tiny side room is to be Peter Van Dam's bedroom. And then, just as in the front part of the building, there is an attic in the loft. So there you are. Now I've introduced you to the whole of our lovely annex. Yours, Anne. So what she's described, where they are living, may sound spacious. She's kind of giving you a tour. I will let you, in just a minute, actually explore the space where they lived. And you'll see that for two families plus one other man, so there were a total of 8 people living in this space for 2 years. It's a pretty confined space that they were living in, never leaving, never seeing the outside. When we think about what quarantine means to us, we can go into our yards, we can walk around our block, we can wave to our neighbors, but these were not things that they were allowed to do in any way. In fact, they had to be silent at many times. So I'm going to read one more excerpt before we stop, and then I will introduce you to the tour of the Anne Frank House Museum and let you have some time. I'm going to show you a little bit by along with me, and then I'll let you continue that on your own. Okay. Last excerpt. Wednesday evening, March 24th, 1943. So now we see just under a year has gone by, several months that they've been living in this space. Father, Mother, Margot, and I were sitting pleasantly together when Peter suddenly came in and whispered in Father's ear. So Peter is a member of the other family that's living with them. I caught the words barrel falling over in the warehouse and someone fiddling with the door. Margot heard it too, but was trying to calm me down since I turned white as chalk and was extremely nervous. Now remember, they're hiding from the Nazis who would kill them or capture them if they were discovered. The 3 of us waited. In the meantime, Father and Peter went downstairs. In a minute or two, Mrs. Van Dam came up from where she'd been listening to the radio. She told us that Pim had asked her to switch it off and tiptoe upstairs. But you know what happens when you're trying to be quiet. Those old stairs creaked twice as loud. 5 minutes later, Peter and Pim, the color drained from their faces, appeared again to relate their experience. They had positioned themselves under the staircase and waited. Nothing happened. Then all of a sudden, they heard a couple of bangs as if doors had been slammed shut inside the house. Pim bounded up the stairs while Peter went to warn Dussel, the family who finally presented himself upstairs. Dussel is the other man who's living with them. There's the Van Dam family, and then there's Dussel, who is the other gentleman who's living in their home. We all tiptoed in our stocking feet to the Van Dam family on the next floor. Mr. Van Dam had a bad cold and had already gone to bed, so we gathered around his bedside and discussed our suspicions in a whisper. Every time Mr. Van Dam coughed loudly, Mrs. Van Dam and I had a nervous fit. He kept coughing until someone came up with the bright idea of giving him codeine. His cough subsided immediately. Once again, we waited and waited, but heard nothing. Finally, we came to the conclusion that whoever it was had fled when they heard footsteps in an otherwise quiet building. The problem now was that the chairs in the private offices were neatly grouped around the radio, which was tuned to England. If the burglars had forced the door and the air raid wardens were to notice it and call the police, it would get the ball rolling and there would be serious repercussions. So Mr. Van Dam got up, pulled on his coat and pants, put on his hat, and cautiously followed Father down the stairs, with Peter, armed with a heavy hammer to be on the safe side, right behind him. The ladies, including Margot and me, waited in suspense until the men returned 5 minutes later to tell us there was no sign of any activity in the building. We agreed not to run any hot water or flush the toilet, but since everyone's stomach was churning from the tension, you can imagine, after we had all had a turn to use the bathroom. Incidents like these were always accompanied by other disasters, and this was no exception. Number 1, the Westeroran bells stopped chiming, and they were always so comforting. Plus, Mrs. Volksköjel left early last night, and we weren't sure if he'd given Bep the key and she had forgotten to lock the door again. Well, the night had just begun, and we still weren't sure what to expect. We were somewhat reassured by the fact that between 8:15, when the burglar had first entered the building, and 10:30, we hadn't heard a sound. So when they're talking about a burglar, when Anna's talking about a burglar, she's kind of, it may not be a burglar in the way that we think of, like, oh, someone coming in to steal something. It may be soldiers. It may be somebody looking to inform on them. So, it has probably some greater meaning than we might think of, when you hear a bump in the night. Besides, it occurred to us that the warehouse manager at the keg company next door might still be at work. What with the excitement and the thin walls, it's easy to mistake sounds. Besides, your imagination often plays tricks on you in moments of danger. So we all lay down on our beds, though not to sleep. Father and Mother and Mr. Dussel were awake most of the night, and I'm not exaggerating when I say we got hardly a wink of sleep. This morning the men were downstairs to see if the outside door was still locked, but all was well. Of course, we gave the entire office staff a blow-by-blow account of the incident, which had been far from pleasant, and much easier to laugh at these kinds of things after they had happened. And Beth was the only one who took us seriously. I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to show you a bit of what their annex actually looked like. Here we go. So the Anne Frank house. Now, remember when we were learning last week about primary sources and where you can find primary sources, one of the primary places where you will find a primary source is in a museum. Now, some museums, you have museums like the Museum of Natural History, where you'll find all kinds of unique artifacts from different times and places. And then you have something like the Anne Frank House, whose job is to tell a very specific story. So this is the website for the Anne Frank House. It's in Amsterdam. It is one of the most popular museums in the world. So many people have read Anne Frank's diary and have been affected by this story and the power of her story. And I'm going to remind you, this is not a survival story. This is a tragedy. Remember, as I told you in the beginning, Anne Frank did not survive the war. Her father did and was able to publish her diary and share the story afterward. But she did die as a young teenager in very tragic circumstances. And this is where her story takes place. So let's step inside the secret annex. I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour here. So I think this is such a cool feature of this website. You can actually explore the rooms and see. So this is the landing that Anne Frank described. So you can actually move this, this cursor around and see the doors. This is the actual house. You can see the bookcases. You can see, you can learn about the room, and you can click through to different doors. So here we are going to go through this door here into the actual Frank household. So this is the room where the rest of her family lived, her mother, father, and sister. And we're actually going to go through to, I believe it's this door. Yes. And this is the room where she lived in hiding in the secret annex. She had to share this room with Mr. Pfeffer, who she refers to by a different name. It's never been clear to me why. Mr. Dussel is the name that she gives him in the diary. It's never been clear to me why she calls him that name, but for some reason, they arranged it in having to share space with these people, that she actually was sharing this space with her father's friend. So you can even see the beds they slept in, the pictures that she had on the wall. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to give you some time. I'm going to post the links to these and let you explore Anne Frank's house on your own. See how small the rooms are. Imagine what it would be like to spend 2 years in that space, confined with your family, confined with another family, wondering if you're ever going to be able to come out. And think about that, the power of the primary source. How is it different to see that space versus just to read somebody else's description of it? How is it different to hear Anne Frank's own description of it than to hear somebody else maybe tell you about her? Even to hear me tell you about her. How is that different than to hear it in her own words? So I'm going to leave you with that, and have a great week, everybody. I know this is some heavy material this week, but I hope that you are interested in reading more. Oh, I'm also going to post, in addition to the link to the virtual tour where you can explore the house, there was a really amazing production that the Anne Frank house did, turning the diary into sort of a video diary with an actor performing it. It's almost like it's like a vlog. It's like a video diary, video blog almost. It feels so current, and I'm really impressed with the way that it was made. So it's like a movie that you can watch, and I'm going to post it up. Please, it's not required, but I really think that you will enjoy it and find it interesting and cool. And I hope that you read more of the book as well. So that's me, Mrs. Kalin, signing off. Have a good week, everybody. Thanks.